Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 35. Today we're happy to have Dr. Matthew Fugate with us. He is an expert on ADHD, and he has done a lot of really fascinating research that I think is going to help you as parents of ADHD kids, or if you're a counselor or educator of kids with ADHD. I think there are some things that we can do to make it easier for kids to deal with their ADHD, and this was a really enlightening interview that I'm excited for you to hear. So don't go away. So a little housekeeping first. I want to say thank you to our new Patreon supporters this week. Heather, Aurora, and Carolyn have joined our Patreon community, and we really appreciate their help. The Mind Matters podcast is a passion project for my husband Dave and me, but it is very time intensive and it's expensive, and every little bit helps. If you're somebody who values this podcast and gets a lot out of it, you could donate whatever amount feels comfortable to you. We're working on providing some opportunities for our Patreon supporters, and there's some exclusive content there, as well as future opportunities to be part of our panel of experts and other community pieces. So please join us.
Hello.
Sounds like our guest is warmed up and ready.
I'm Matt Fugate. I am an assistant professor in educational psychology at the University of Houston downtown. My primary research focus is in underserved populations, more specifically students who are gifted with ADHD.
Stay with us.
Previously on Mind Matters.
This is Jen Merrill from Laughing at Chaos and author of If This Is a Gift, Can I Send It Back?
I wanted to ask you about parent self-care for parents of gifted and twice-exceptional kids.
There's a lot out there for gifted kids and for twice-exceptional kids. There's nothing out there for their parents. Their parents are doing the heavy lifting. So my goal now is, my kids are getting older and I have more time to think, which is glorious, by the way. Is to do more advocacy for the parents because they need it. I actually have a rule in my house. It's blood, bone, vomit, fire, flood, zombie. Unless one of those things are actively happening at that moment, you can handle it by yourself while I'm resting. Yes, you get to be selfish and take care of you, please.
Look for episode 33 wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
So Dr. Matthew Fugate is today's guest, and I came across some of his work while I was researching for a book that I just finished writing. He is an assistant professor at the University of Houston downtown, and I actually reached out to him because I had some questions about his research, and I just found it really fascinating. Dr. Fugate has looked at ADHD from a lot of different directions and perspectives, and I am really hopeful that his findings will help not only parents and educators of kids already diagnosed with ADHD, but also anyone who just even suspects that a student or a child may have it. So, Matthew, let's start by reminding our listeners exactly what ADHD is and what symptoms we should be looking for.
ADHD is a neurological condition, often defined with consistent patterns of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity, that can cause interference with the individual's day-to-day life. And that can manifest itself in a variety of ways. It can result in lots of disorganization, difficulty maintaining attention to tasks, particularly tasks that are of low interest or repetitive. A lot of times these students will avoid anything that they dislike or are reluctant to engage in because it might require that sustained mental effort. And in schools, we see this with classroom work, with homework. Homework is a huge issue. I'm a little ADHD myself, which is why I think I gravitated towards this area. I'm constantly losing things or misplacing them. There's also a lot of distraction by external stimuli. So if I'm in an area where there's a lot of activity going on, I have a hard time focusing on the people I'm with.
Yeah. So kind of like that difficulty filtering out the important versus the non-important.
Exactly. And there's this idea of lowered latent inhibition. And we see this a lot with students who are ADHD.
Right.
When I'm with teachers, I put it this way, we all have a peripheral vision. People without ADHD, they're able to focus. They're able to close off their peripheral. For people with ADHD, we can't close off our peripheral. So this information is always coming in, which has its advantages and disadvantages.
I can relate to you about the diagnosis. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid back at a time when girls especially were not really diagnosed. And so it's one of the things I feel like, when I'm working with either when I was a teacher and worked with my students or now working with my clients, I can really kind of connect with that. And I think even as an adult, I recognize that in myself too. And it's taken me a long time to just even kind of get to that point where I really kind of have that self-awareness of what goes along with that. There's a stigma about an ADHD diagnosis that is pretty pervasive.
One of the studies I did a few years ago looked specifically at ADHD in girls who are gifted during their secondary education years. Their experiences are very different from that of boys. And often they are seen very differently by their peers and the adults in their lives. And so that creates a unique set of challenges for them.
So let's tie this back into giftedness. What is the prevalence of ADHD in people who are also gifted? Does it occur more often? Does it occur less often?
That's the $64 million question. In general, it's estimated that there are about 385,000 twice-exceptional students, those students who are gifted and that encompasses all the ands sitting in our classrooms today. But what we don't have is a systematic way of truly identifying these students because unlike special education, that there's a federal mandate for giftedness, it varies from state to state. And there's also a lot of still misunderstanding about the fact that you can be gifted and you can be gifted and have a behavioral difference or a learning difference. And so it's really hard to estimate the prevalence of this, but I would suspect it's much higher than we think it is.
Right, because a lot of those students are probably compensating because of their cognitive ability.
Oh, exactly. And let's face it, teachers are the gatekeepers to identification for giftedness. And unfortunately, they often look at behaviors. And so if you're seeing a student who's not turning in their homework, not completing their work in class, who acts out in class because of impulsivity and hyperactivity, they are unfortunately often the ones who the teachers are like, the way they behave, they couldn't possibly be gifted.
Yeah.
We're starting to see less of that, but it's still there.
Well, I know the universal screening that a lot of districts have gone to has helped with some of that. But I mean, I know a lot of districts still use teacher referrals, as part of their screening process.
And I wish I could do away with them in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
But quite honestly, even some of the screeners and the tools we're using aren't necessarily appropriate for those children.
Tell me more about that.
They still get missed because one of the issues with people with ADHD is this breakdown in the executive functioning of working memory, that ability to hold things in mind, in the purest layman's term, hold things in mind just long enough to carry out a task. And that can cause a breakdown in a lot of our traditional settings. So when we are in this age of educational accountability, still relying on not only tests like the COGAT and the NNAT, but also relying on results from standardized state assessments as part of the criterion that is looked at in the overall view, then it can be difficult for those children to qualify. It's not that they can't do well, it's that they don't do well on those types of assessments for a number of reasons.
We're not getting an accurate measurement of their true ability.
Exactly. One of the things that I always try to encourage is to add in other pathways for these students. So using things like Torrance tests of creative thinking abilities, using things like the Hope Scale, where it gives a better picture of these students' abilities.
So I know there's always also the question about misdiagnosis, that characteristics of giftedness will be perceived as ADHD inaccurately. What do you know about how often that occurs?
We don't know. We have no empirical evidence one way or another on this idea of misdiagnosis. We have anecdotal evidence, but it's not something that we've been able to empirically quantify. I do know people often fall very strongly on one side of the argument or another. Mm-hmm. Several years ago, I was speaking with a mother in the Pacific Northwest whose daughter was gifted and ADHD. And she felt very strongly about this idea of misdiagnosis, and it angered her because for her experience, there was no misdiagnosis. Her child was gifted and she was ADHD. Mm-hmm. And we know if you start to look at the characteristics between these two, being gifted and having ADHD, we see a lot of overlap, as much as 80% in some of the characteristics. So the potential for misdiagnosis, I would never say outright it's not there, but it can be a controversial topic.
Let's talk about some of those characteristics, when you so if you think of the Venn diagram, so we've got the gifted on one side and then the ADHD on the other. And so what are some of those characteristics of the kids, that kind of fall in both of those realms? They're the twice-exceptional gifted ADHD kids.
Not doing work that doesn't interest them. Get easily bored with repetitive tasks. Hyper-focus in areas of high interest, which when you're dealing with those kids, gifted and ADHD, when you get any of these three groups in a situation where they are highly interested, then the struggle becomes to transition them away from that experience into something else. Mm-hmm. There can be a lot of angst among our gifted kids who become frustrated sometimes with peers that aren't on their intellectual level. And so they have a hard time building relationships with same age peers. And when we look at our students with impulsivity issues related to ADHD, maintaining those friendships with peers can be difficult.
Yeah.
So you start to get a lot of these little things that can look alike. And it's out of that this idea of misidentification, misdiagnosis has been born.
It's confusing. You see a student who is able to focus when it's a preferred activity, but then when it's something that they're not really interested in, they couldn't force themselves if they tried. I mean, it's just too much for that task initiation and that persistence to be able to get through that. But it gets interpreted as laziness,
right,
or lack of motivation. And, it breaks my heart for those kids because it's more than that, and then that becomes sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, as they internalize some of those messages.
Definitely. Looking back at this study with the gifted girls, one of my participants, Leah, related a story about being in science class and how her science teacher didn't understand her because she struggled in that class. She would sometimes act out in that class. So this teacher moved her toward the back of the classroom. Well, that happened to be right next to the fish tank. So here she is in a class where she struggles. She feels like the teacher doesn't understand her, so she has a hard time focusing anyway. So where did her attention go?
She's watching the fish. Yeah.
Right? And then she talked about how the teacher would ask her a question. Her mind had gone elsewhere. She wasn't really sure where the conversation had gone. She would attempt to answer what she thought the question was. And she said, I would get it wrong, and then I felt stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And that's heartbreaking.
Yeah. It's really hard to overcome that when it does become ingrained in your identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about the connection between ADHD and creativity. How do those things connect and overlap?
So there have been several studies that have looked at this question. White and Shaw have done a lot of work looking at this. I looked at it comparing students who were gifted without ADHD characteristics and those with those characteristics of ADHD. White and Shaw found that those students who were also ADHD had a preference for idea generation. And they tied it to this idea of lowered latent inhibition because they're constantly taking in all this information. Those students with ADHD really were able to come up with these fascinating, creative, thoughtful ideas. And it was the students without ADHD who had a preference not for idea generation, but taking those ideas and culling through them. Mm-hmm. What's the most practical? How can we make it work?
Yeah.
When I looked at the students, comparing students, and these were students from 5th grade through high school, through 12th grade, just looking at levels of creative thinking using the Torrance test, we found that the group that was gifted with ADHD were significantly higher in their creative thinking ability, divergent thinking ability, than the students who were gifted without those characteristics. And so it was fascinating because ours was the first study to really look specifically at giftedness and gifted ADHD in that capacity, because all the previous studies had been of mixed ability levels.
Right.
And what was exciting is when we looked at the effect size, you can get statistical significance, but does that actually mean anything? And when we looked at the effect size, we found we got a score of 0.86, which means not only was it statistically significant, it was practically significant. It meant something, which translates into we have to make changes in our classroom to meet the needs of these students, to build up that ability for creative thinking.
Yeah. I feel like people, when they think about creativity, they lump it into fine arts.
Yeah.
And I think gifted ed teachers in general, I think they have a different conceptualization of that, just from my experience working in the gifted ed classroom.
Yes.
But sometimes we forget about the different ways that creativity can manifest.
Exactly. And understanding that there is creativity in math, in science, in language arts, in history and social studies. And how do you pull that out? Schools have become so focused on the critical thinking aspect that the creative thinking piece has gotten lost. And I'll be honest, I have come across even teachers of gifted students who still think when you talk about creativity, they think artistic ability. They think of those fine arts ties to creativity, not the thinking outside the box.
The divergent thinking.
Exactly.
You wrote a chapter for Scott Barry Kaufman's book, Twice-Exceptional.
Yes.
And if I'm recalling correctly, the title of that chapter was Attention, Divergent, Hyperactive, Giftedness. Did I get that right?
You did.
Tell us about that, how you came up with that and what that means, and what does it mean for parents and teachers too?
That is a term that I started. You'll notice when I talk about R2E kids, I try to avoid any language focused on deficit, disorder, dysfunction. I don't like those terms. They're very negative. They imply can't.
Yeah.
It's not that these students can't do something. It's just that they learn and behave differently.
Mm.
It's up to us as educators to understand what those differences are and how can we leverage those differences to help these students succeed. And so in playing around with attention deficit hyperactive disorder, I was trying to think of how can we build this in a positive way that really highlights who these students are and the strengths that they have, not the deficit. And so just started playing around with it, and we came up with ADHD. It's not attention deficit, it's divergent attention, hyperactive giftedness. I'm passionate about this. I'm creative. I have all these ideas. And so I always say every time I present on this, I'm like, start spreading it. Stop calling your kids ADHD. They're ADHD. And so in that chapter, I was trying to really highlight that this is a paradigm shift that we need to start thinking about when we're working with these students.
Taking that strengths-based approach, which I feel like, just within the neurodiversity kind of movement, that really is a big part of it, is everybody has abilities and right. Everybody has struggles, but let's focus on the strengths and move forward from there instead of trying to change them, instead of trying to fit that square peg in a round hole.
I tell my undergraduate future teachers all the time, on that first day of school, when you're greeting those 22, 23, 25 precious little sets of eyes that are walking into your classroom, at the end of the day, the only one who has to change is you. We can't do the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
We, the educators, the teachers, the administrators, the gifted coordinators, we're the ones who need to adapt to their needs.
I got goosebumps as you're just saying that. I feel like that's such a powerful message for educators and sometimes parents maybe to hear too, that we don't have to fix or change our kids. We have to change our perspective.
Yeah. And there has been movement within the neurodiversity community for this strength-based approach that hasn't yet filtered down to our schools. We still tend to operate in school from a deficit perspective. I mean, think about the IEP and annual review meetings that parents sit in. When I present, I kind of paint the picture of, these parents walk into this big conference room and it's filled with very important people. And if you don't believe me, just ask them, because they're going to go around and introduce themselves and tell you how important they are.
That's exactly how it is. Yeah.
Exactly. And, and they all are carrying big files of paper, right? And after you've gone through and made the introduction, the first thing that happens, generally, the diagnostician or the head of the special education department will begin to talk about all the things the child can't do. To this day, I don't know when I was in the classroom if this was a change that our special education department made in general, or if it was just with the ARDs that I took part in, because after a while, I would interrupt, before we get started, and I'd open my big file and say, look at where we started the year. Look at where we are now. Let me tell you about some of the great things that your child has been doing. Let's talk about all the growth and the areas of interest that we've discovered that we've been able to use in the classroom. So after a while, my special education department was just like, and I think Mr. Fugate has something he wants to say.
They were just open with you.
Yeah. They figured out I'm going to talk anyway. But it changed the dynamic of those conversations.
Yeah, the entire tone.
Yeah. And then when we were building those IEPs, we were able to say, okay, based upon these strengths, these improvements that we've seen, how can we leverage that as we develop the educational plan moving forward?
It's that self-reflection. How do we change the environment instead of changing the child?
Exactly.
So this has been a really great conversation. Give us some final thoughts about what you'd like for parents and educators and counselors to remember.
I would urge, first of all, for parents, education, helping them as much as teachers and educators are just starting to really grasp this idea of twice-exceptionality in general and the strengths that these students display. I would want parents to offer opportunities to educate those parents. For the teachers, really thinking about how can I change what I do in the classroom? These students have a very global view, and our education system isn't built currently to meet those needs. We are a very skills-based system still. But for these kids, they take a very global view. They need a relevant problem. And as they are addressing that relevant problem, then we can introduce those skills, what Joe Renzulli calls that just-in-time teaching. I'm going to introduce these basic skills when you need them, because now it will be relevant. Rather than working from skills up, we need to work from the big problem down.
They need to know what the point is. Why am I doing this?
Exactly. Why am I doing this? It's important. It's important for these kids. So I would really encourage teachers to look at what they're doing in their classrooms. And quite honestly, it's going to be good for more than just their 2E kids.
Dr. Matthew Fugate, thanks.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I think ADHD mostly just means that you can see the big picture really well compared to other people. That's just my opinion.
A lot of the times, if there's a piece of paper in front of me, I read it involuntarily. But if the teacher was talking out loud and telling us instructions out loud, I almost never followed all of them. I would have to go back, and it was usually a group assignment when the teacher would talk like that, and I'd have to ask the other people in my group what they just said, or I would just pretend like I knew what we were doing, and I would just sit there and go, okay, what do we do next?
I think it's a struggle to even show up sometimes because I don't even realize how much it impacts me when I'm not thinking about it, but there are so many times when my ADHD affects me from going to school because I wake up in the morning and I'm like, oh, I don't feel good. Is it really worth my time today? Am I really going to get anything out of this? Am I really going to learn? And then I do end up getting behind because that's what happens.
I feel like I have a lot harder time doing things for a long period of time without getting really, really distracted. And then I'm also a lot more observant and a lot more creative than your average person. So it does come in handy occasionally.
I never did my homework. The only reason why I got good grades in any class is because I did well on tests.
I think so many of my teachers and just teachers in my school don't even know how ADHD affects kids. And I don't think that they know how many kids really have it.
They seem to think about it like, okay, this student has ADHD, that means they this, and this. As opposed to like, this student has ADHD, what does he or she need? We're almost like generalized as like, okay, this guy has ADHD, he can't focus, make him focus. As opposed to like, this kid has ADHD, what does he need specifically?
Those teachers that don't understand, they're kind of just like, push through it, you have to do it, just push through it. And it's like, well, that's not good advice for me because I know that's the logic. I know I have to do that, but it's not going to fix anything just telling me. And those are the classes that I typically don't do the best in.
A lot of these episodes are personally meaningful for me, but I have to admit that this one really hit home. I think that I've probably just come to terms with what it means for me to be twice exceptional with a diagnosis of ADHD, probably within the last 3 years or so. I'm finally starting to accept what that means about my strengths and also my struggles. and it's helping me to let go of the negative things that I've been told and internalized over all of these years. And the memories that I have about my own journey with ADHD are seared into my mind, like the time the teacher didn't think I should be allowed to attend the gifted program because I wasn't getting my homework turned in. Or I remember my face just turning bright red and looking down at the floor when my teacher asked me in front of the whole class if I'd remembered to take my medicine that day. I cried when I wasn't invited to go to the movies with a friend because their parents thought I was too hyper. I didn't understand it, and I don't think anyone else around me really did either. If you've listened to this show before, you know that I am not afraid of labels. It kind of reminds me of Harry Potter and He Who Shall Not Be Named. If you're afraid to talk about something and call it what it is, you can't have power over it or harness it. ADHD, like giftedness and autism and any other diagnosis, is both yin and yang. Our kids, whether you're their parent or you're their teacher, they deserve the gift of self-understanding so they can grow into who they're meant to be. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time.
There's no one like you, my little girl. Your eyes so blue under those brown curls. Soon you're on your way. Promise me that you know the world is yours. Strike them with your glow. Go on now, be good, be fine. Live your life, dream big, don't forget to be kind. Live, it's your life.
We'd like to thank Dr. Matthew Fugate for appearing on today's episode. If you want to know more about his work, you'll find links on today's episode page at mindmatterspodcast.com. While you're there, you can listen to past episodes, get in touch with us, or check out our social media pages. You definitely want to follow us on Twitter at MindMattersPod. And we hardly ever, almost never, RTDMs or break the TOS. Look it up. We're also on Facebook at Mind Matters Podcast, by the way. The executive producer of Mind Matters is me, Dave Morris, and for Emily and the entire huge production staff, the kitchen help, our break room maitre d', the hairstylists, our personal assistants, and of course our wine sommelier. That's just us. Thanks for listening. Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.